Welcome to the 15th episode of the Rain Race podcast. Today we're going to be talking about IndyCar's slight modification to the super-speedway aero package. We're going to be talking about Red Bull's switch to Honda power in Formula 1. We're going to continue our discussion on the 2020 and 2024 LMP1 regulations, and we're going to round it all off with a Le Mans recap. I'm Chris Aurelio. This is Rain Race. Let's go. Episode 15 here of the Rain Race podcast. I am joined here alongside, as always, Kyle Cuthbertson.
What's up?
That was a very delayed response. And Kevin Rollins making his return for the first time, well, in 2 weeks.
Hi.
Yes. So, past week was the 24 Hours of Le Mans, one of the races of the Triple Crown, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, for obvious reasons if you watch the race. This is going to be a little bit of
a...
Yeah, well, let's just spoil the whole thing right now.
That's funny.
This is going to be a shorter episode. We're going to be skipping, in case you missed it on this episode, just jumping into a couple news stories, and then we'll be recapping Le Mans. That's pretty much going to set the entire episode up here. The first thing I want to talk about is actually not on the sports car side of things. It's on the IndyCar side of things, since it seems like we always have something IndyCar related to talk about. But just recently announced, Dallara is going to be offering a new front wing for the Pocono race in August. So I'm not the resident IndyCar expert here. So Kyle, if you'd like to sort of take the leads on this one, on the new part that Dallara is offering.
Yeah, it appears on the front wing there's going to be two optional added wickers on the front, like gurney flaps, basically. There's going to be one on the main plane, which basically looks the same as what we've had this year at the aero kit, where you can do the gurney flaps on the front wing. But then in like the secondary like crease and like that little bend by the nose cone, there's going to be like another extension for the gurney flap. So there's going to be two gurney flap extensions that they will optionally be able to use. Hopefully they're hoping this could add downforce to the front wing, because as you heard in the interviews during our month of May, that the drivers were saying that the front wing really wasn't doing much for them, because there really wasn't a lot, and they really have to rely on the front wing because the rear wing does less than the front wing. So it's going to be interesting, because I mean, we knew Pocono was going to probably be the most downforce track that we're going to have to deal with in the oval wise, because Pocono historically has been tricky in downforce, even in the manufacturer aero kits. So they are allowing two different gurney flaps on the front wing.
So, Kevin, you were obviously firsthand present throughout the entire month of May, and this new aero package is obviously in response to the races we had at Indianapolis and Texas, where drivers and fans were complaining about the style of racing. It just really seemed to be very spread out. Drivers really couldn't seem to get the cars nailed to the ground that well compared to recent years. Do you think that this was the right approach for them to take, or do you think that this front wing addition is maybe a little unnecessary? Because I saw a lot of people saying that the rear wing was what they needed to work on the most.
So I got two things. When you talk about the front wing versus rear wing, it kind of fluctuated throughout the month of May on which one was the issue. It was one or the other. It wasn't both. Through practice and qualifying was the front wing, and then when we got to the race, it seemed to transfer over to the rear wing. I mean, there was no real good balance that anybody could find. As for the changes to the front wing, I think this is the most that they can do. I mean, remember, I think I said it on here, or it was with David or something, how really the things got screwed up because of the tests that got canceled back in April, and they really didn't have time to modify the aero kits. And the same remains true, because it's a very short gap between Indianapolis and Texas, which are, the two closest oval races, and two of the three that use the oval aero kit. I think this will actually be a positive change, but also we get to see teams start to play with the aero kits a little bit more, because now there's more pieces to play with.
Yeah, before all we really had were those sidewalls at the diffuser, which at Texas they were mandated to leave those off, which was interesting to me. I'm kind of interested now to see what they do at Pocono, if they'll like give them an option to use the sidewalls in the diffuser, or if they just tell them to take them off or tell them to put them on. I think that's going to be another interesting key to Pocono.
Well, again, look at how many pieces that the team could alter before the new parts. I mean, you had the existing wickers on the front and rear wing. You had the wickers on the side pod with the flick, or on the ramp, excuse me. And then you had the diffuser. That was really about it. So now you got even more aero elements that you can play with, and I'm pretty sure that we all know that Team Penske is going to be the one that takes advantage of it.
It's a very minor.
Most likely.
Yeah, it's a very minor change. Is one thing I like to point out. It's just a small addition to the front wing. So personally, I don't see that this is going to be making a huge difference in the quality of the racing. I don't think it's going to be any dramatic difference like day and night. I just think overall a lot of drivers will find the cars a little bit easier to handle. But you never know, because there was some drivers saying, like you mentioned, that it was actually the rear downforce on the car that was a problem. So for that, for the drivers who are complaining in that aspect, it could actually be a little counterintuitive going on. And moving on off of IndyCar and onto another open wheel series, Formula One, they have, well, actually, I should say Red Bull Racing have just recently announced that starting next year in the 2019 season, they will be switching to Honda power units. This isn't really particularly out of nowhere news, because they were speculating that beforehand. And in fact, I saw an article from some pretty reliable sources just about a week or two ago saying that it was pretty much guaranteed at this point. They were just waiting for Red Bull to make the announcement. Obviously very controversial in the world, because Honda hasn't had the best reliability or performance ever since they came back in 2015, particularly in the McLaren era. It looks like they're doing slightly better with Toro Rosso. However, it'll be interesting to see how Red Bull can handle this partnership with Honda, because I think from the very beginning you have people who blamed McLaren for that era of poor performance and poor reliability, and then you had people who strictly blame Honda. So I think it'll be interesting to see how well the two can get along and work together. We could see that this could be a benefit to Red Bull. Obviously, they aren't too happy right now with the Renault power unit. Similar situation to Toro Rosso last season. So looking forward, it's obviously a very interesting change, because they are one of the strongest teams on the grid right now. And there are some people saying that this will make them either mid-pack or almost even a backmarker next season.
I would agree with. Okay, so this is actually a very interesting topic, because if you look at Toro Rosso this season, they've done either really good or really bad. They really haven't been that consistent when it comes down to it. I mean, they got really good points at Bahrain, but they've kind of been up and down. So this is kind of confusing for me, because the Renault power, it's worked. It has worked for many years. I don't see why they needed to change.
Well, I think really the reason to change is, like you see in F1, Mercedes and Ferrari manufacturer, their team is always going to be higher, and they're always going to be one step ahead of all the other teams, except for maybe Renault Sport, which even Renault Sport, the manufacturer team, they haven't been quite competitive. So it's kind of like the McLaren philosophy when they started with Honda, where you can't win a championship with a customer engine. And we've seen Renault and Red Bull, especially last year, really have their struggles. And I don't think Renault is as a top-notch power plant as, like, say, the Ferraris or the Mercedes have. I just think that Adrian Newey knows how to really work the aero with the Red Bull. And seeing how Honda has really up their game this season, I think for next season, if we can get Red Bull, Honda really working, we don't get a lot of failures like we saw with McLaren. I think it'll be a better, like I always said with McLaren, if Honda ever got everything worked out and they could finish races and be somewhat there, I always said they had an advantage over the customer teams, because the customer teams that buy the engines are always going to get second grade motors compared to the constructors. So I can kind of see the philosophy of it, but I mean, yeah, being so competitive with Renault, it kind of is like an off thing, but still, there's still a philosophy behind it.
Well, and we're going to see Toro Rosso and Red Bull with the same power plants again, which is something that we haven't seen since I believe 2015 or 2016 when they both had Renault power. Or no, it was 2017 because Toro Rosso had Ferrari for a year. But anyways, at this point, it's kind of developing the engine for Toro Rosso. It's getting it as the best it could be for the pro team, or the senior team, that is. I mean, we know that the aero is damn good on the Red Bulls. I'm just kind of curious on how everything's going to work out with the power plant. I mean, yeah, we've seen Renault slip up quite a bit in the last couple of years, especially last year. But at the same time, they're taking a risk with Honda.
Yeah, pretty much all tying back into what I was saying earlier. I feel like they don't know how this move is going to fare for them. But like Kyle mentioned himself, they're really in a position right now where they have to try something because right now they're running as a Renault customer engine, and you're not really going to get any flying chance at a championship with that at this point in time with the way Mercedes and Ferrari are running. So I feel like this is a risky decision for them, but like you said, Kevin, it could end up being one that pays off. We'll have to see how Honda's power units end up faring next season. And the last bit of news I want to go over here today is Kyle and I touched on this last week, the new LMP1 or WEC hypercar regulations for the top class in the WEC. Well, they revealed more details about it last Friday, along with the 2024 regulations. What they expect from the 2024 regulations, I should say, not anything really set in stone yet. But like we mentioned last week, if you didn't hear, hypercar concepts. So pretty much, I don't want to say similar to DPI cars because they're pretty much on a league of their own with the way they're manufactured. They're, of course, P2 cars with manufactured bodywork. These are going to be pretty much ground-up cars like we already have in the LMP1 class, with some road car styling cues on them. So if I had to make an analogy to another class, it's pretty much like the GT1 days, although we'll see more of that prototype design in them. Reduced budgets is one thing that they talked about wanting to have. They want to cut the budget pretty much by 75%. And they've talked about the new hybrid system. Now, the new hybrid system they want is a KERS system similar to what they have right now. It'll continue to power the front wheels, but the KERS system that they have in their cars will have to be one that they use on their production cars. And that's actually very interesting because that means that the road car manufacturers who want to invest in this class have to go out and then build a road car with the same hybrid system. So that pretty much eliminates some manufacturers to race cars that they already have, such as, like, I know I went ambitious and said if Ford wanted to do something with the Ford GT, well, that car is not hybrid powered, so they'd have to make a second, well, I guess it wouldn't be second anymore, it'd be third or iteration of that car by now, with an all-new hybrid system. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure if that's the right direction for them to be going, because that might shy away some of these road car manufacturers. Not all of them really want to have hybrid technology in their hypercars. Right now it looks like Mercedes is going that route, and McLaren is going that route as well with the Senna, but I'm not sure. Maybe this is not the right approach for them to be taking.
Again, we've seen it time after time that the ACO keeps making more and more questionable decisions. And again, they are very reactionary, and they're trying to build up the top class again. But some of the steps that they're taking to promote hybrid technology is kind of undoing everything that they're doing to try to grow the class.
Another thing to note is that just like the era that we're in right now, they aren't restricting your choice of engine, so you can have any cylinder capacity you want, pretty much, as long as it's not going to slow you down like a W16 or something. They're not putting a restriction on the size, so you can have whatever size you want. They just want a quote-unquote ideal world of engine variants. So I think that's a positive thing to see. We always like to see a variation, especially when Porsche and Audi were still here. You had diesels up against petrol cars. You had V4s up against V8s. Just pretty much an ideal era for people who like diversity in racing. And pretty much the last thing is that they are expecting lap times to be around the 320 range in qualifying, which is down just a couple seconds. This year we saw Toyota get up into the 315s this year. So a little bit slower, but naturally that would be the case with cars that are more GT-esque.
Well, the only concern that I have with having GTS cars is the thing with prototypes was they got to test new things. Like Audi got to test the LED lights, like all these cool concepts that weren't yet out on street cars. That could be a little bit threatened because again, they're trying to keep them as close to street spec as possible. So that's going to limit how many things that they can really test before they put it on the actual cars that go on the street.
And they also do, I forgot to mention this as well, they also want to keep a privateer presence in the class. So they were talking about how manufacturers should make their hybrid units available to privateers at a set price. So that way we don't really have any massive competition, drive all the privateers out. They want to pretty much have a designated price to put these hybrid units up should privateers want to invest in them. Not so sure how that'll work after what we saw this season. Obviously, if they're on fair game, I think a lot of privateers have potential. But it'll be very interesting to see what approach they take. We'd have to see them probably partner up with a manufacturer because of the road car styling that these new regulations are putting forward. And as I hinted to earlier, 2024, they want to introduce hydrogen cars into the top class. A lot of people are pretty skeptical about that. Obviously, hydrogen can be very dangerous if it's contained improperly. So it'll be interesting to see. But there were manufacturers such as BMW who are interested in investing in hydrogen technology. So if it's all for benefiting the class and the stability of the class, I'm all for it. But that's quite a ways in the future. We'll have to see how the manufacturers step up to the plate with that one. Last thing for this episode will be our Le Mans recap. And seeing that it was a 24-hour race, there's quite a bit to go over. And I feel like the best person to put in charge of this is Kevin. So, Kevin, why don't you run us off from the start here?
Right off the start, we had the number one Rebellion actually crash into the back of the Fernando Alonso, because nobody's gonna remember.
Let's just classify it as the number 8 Toyota for now.
Yeah,
but yes,
the 8 car. Crashed into the back of the 8 Toyota, which caused him to lose downforce, and then he spun and hit the back of the Dragon Speed car and lost his nose. It looked like an old Daytona prototype incident, honestly, where the nose just flies off. They only lost about 2 minutes, and then the Toyotas kind of took off. They made a lot of rear bodywork changes throughout the race.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to quickly point this out. Sorry to interrupt, Kevin, but Toyota were making almost an absurd amount of bodywork changes, whether it was front downforce or rear downforce. They seemed to be switching configurations at almost every single pit stop throughout the race.
It
Probably because they could. Yeah, it
reminded me of Peugeot.
They had the time to do that, though, because the privateers weren't really a threat. And part of that's down to pace and part of that's down to incidents, which we'll get into in a little bit here.
Meanwhile, in the GT class, the GT Pro class, it was a fantastic battle at the start. People complain about BOP, and I think this is as good as it's going to get. I mean, the only manufacturer that wasn't there was Aston Martin. And, well, there's not much to be said about that other than this car is about as good as the AMR1 was. In LMP2, it was G-Drive that sort of took it and ran with it. There was fantastic battles throughout the field, but really, we've seen Dallara struggle, but they still were in the top 10 consistently throughout the race, the Dallaras. The Ligiers were a lot more competitive than they were last year, but the Oricas were still the cars to beat. And actually, I'm not really going to cover too much on P2, but the car that took the flag first was the G-Drive car, but they were them and their sister TDS car. By the way, for those of you that don't know, G-Drive Racing is run by two outfits because they have two cars, but one of them is run by Graf Racing and the other one's run by TDS Racing. And it's sort of just a rebadge of the second cars of the teams, respectively. But the TDS run car, the 26, the primary G-Drive car, won the race at first, but then they were excluded, them and the 28 other TDS car, for modifying their fuel grid.
Obviously, the WEC are very strict about their rulings. I mean, it seems to me like a pretty blatant trying to get away with breaking the rules. Obviously, it didn't work out for them. So at least I'm gonna say at least it wasn't something out of their control, like the skid block height at the end of the race. It seems to me like it was a pretty blatant decision to get away with an advantage.
Well, they were gaining 6 seconds per pit stop on refueling.
Yeah, and a lot of teams like Dragon Speed picked up on that with drivers like David Hannemeyer Hansen saying that during the race the engineers at their pit boxes were wondering how the hell they were gaining 5 to 6 seconds on each stop. They just didn't think that was even possible because of how close the cars are pace wise and pretty much specification wise.
Well, and the G Drive car won by a margin of 2 laps over the second place Alpine.
Yeah, so obviously there were some questions to be raised there.
And then the other TDS cars spent quite a bit of time in the garage, and they still were fighting for third place at the end. Actually, yeah, it was third place.
Yeah.
But the final classification was the Alpine took the victory. The Graf car that survived, the non-G Drive Graf car, finished second, and then for the first time, Ligier and the new era of P2 cars actually took the victory, or not victory, took the podium in LMP2. The car that was run by Juan Pablo Montoya after the sister car, the 22 United Autosports car, crashed out at literally hitting a concrete wall at the hands of Paul DiResta. Meanwhile, over in GTM, it was pretty much dominated by the Dempsey Proton Porsche number 77. However, they really didn't build a margin. They were within a lap of everybody else that was competitive. They just led the race. Nobody could really touch them, but yet they were close. So, but GTM, second place, I actually forgot who second place was, but third place, it was the WeatherTech Ferrari, the Keating Motorsports car that held second place for a lot of the race. Meanwhile, in LMP1, we're going to jump to P1 because we're going to talk about GT Pro last, and that's probably going to be the most debatable class because of BOP, and I know me and Kyle are going to get into it a little bit, but I look forward to that. Anyways, so LMP1, no surprise, Toyota 1-2. They changed their bodywork a lot. Rebellion Racing, they had a very solid race. They knew that they weren't going to win. They were going for the podium position, which they were actually failing at that objective for most of the race because the BR Engineering number 17 car from SMP Racing actually held third place by well over a minute for the first third of the race until the same guy who crashed at Spa managed to crash the car. And actually the team manager got yelled at by Eduardo Freitas. I wonder what that's like. Because he would get the car going. Well, what happened was apparently the car seized up and it caused the car to spin and hit the wall. Well, the car pulled out into an unsafe area after getting pushed back, and then they had to take the forklift and move him again. Then he got out again, and they had to move him again. And then he finally got out there, and then it started puffing smoke really bad, and the engine was sparking, and that was sort of the end of the story for that car. The 11 car that had Jensen Button in it, they were in the garage for quite a few hours at the beginning because they had a sensor issue inside of the engine, so they had to tear apart the engine to fix it, which cost them a lot of time. It took them something like 3 or 4 hours to catch up to their team car after it went out in terms of laps completed, which is kind of crazy. But they were charging through there, and they were actually passing GTM cars until their engine gave out in the last hour. The Dragon Speed BR Engineering car, the number 10, it had a pretty solid race after getting caught up in that accident in turn 1. They had a few trips to the garage, but the number 10 ultimately was written off when it had a crash in the Porsche curves. They did get the car back to the pits, but it was unrepairable. The Bicolis car, it crashed very early on with Dominic Crayhammer in the Porsche curves off of a safety car period.
The Bicolis car crashed very, very early, if you remember. Well, it didn't really crash, but it spun out very, very early.
Oh, last year?
No, this year. No, remember, literally off of the line into turn one on the warm-up lap,
Oh,
it spun out.
No, it didn't get started, and then as he started to warm up his tires, he spun, and then he had to start at the back of the field, and he worked his way through.
But
That car had really good pace.
Collis might have had like the worst year they've had yet.
Well, it
couldn't get off the line.
They were out on the first lap last year, so
couldn't get off the line, and then hit the curb. It was not even like the second warm-up lap. It was like literally they had trouble getting off the line, got the car started, turned left, and then hit a curb in the right-hander, and then spun.
To correct you quickly, there is no second warm-up lap. There's just one, but...
Oh, true.
But then Dominic Kramer crashed the car off of a restart, and that caused another safety car period, which leads us into GT Pro. So that safety car period actually kind of was the nail in the coffin for the race, because GT Pro was actually very well balanced on BOP.
Yeah, well, I just want to quickly point out that if anyone saw the results or they saw people complaining on Instagram in terms of drivers, or the reason why the Pink Pig Porsche got such an advantage is because Le Mans has 3 different safety cars in a line spread out at the exact same point on the track. Now, the objective of this is to keep the cars as close as possible to their gaps from when before the yellow, actually, the safety car came out. And that means that if you play your cards lucky and you get to the next safety car line 5 seconds before the car behind you, then you're going to end up with pretty much a 2-minute advantage while they're stuck in the safety car line behind you, which is pretty much a third away from you on the other part of the track. So that's pretty much how the number 1 Porsche played to their advantage.
Actually, there was something else. That's not what did it. They were all in the same safety car queue, but the Porsche pitted, the Pink Pig Porsche, let's try saying that really fast, they pitted right before the safety car came out, and they were able to leave the pit lane while everybody else had to sit and wait, and they had to drop behind the safety car queue.
Yeah, but they had to drop.
Porsche was handed a third of a lap, pretty much.
Yeah, well, same concept though. They still had to fall behind. They still had to fall into the next safety car queue while the Porsche got to go up into the next one.
Yeah, it was based off of pit stops.
Yeah.
Though, however, so the thing about it was the Porsche never pulled out a lap advantage over the guys who were running, who were actually competing for the win. It wasn't until the last hour that they lapped the, crossed the line finished 5th place Corvette. Like, the Corvette was on the lead lap until the last hour. So, and the reason I say that they crossed the line 5th is because the 67 Ford GT was actually handed a 11-lap penalty because Tony Kanaan did not complete his minimum drive time. So they handed an 11-lap and then a 2-minute penalty, which dropped them almost to where the 69 car was, which they did not complete the last 2 hours because they fell out with an electrical issue, and they just completed the final lap, so they'd be classified. But then we saw the fantastic battle between Bourdais and Mako Vicky, and Mako did make some very dickish moves in that battle, but overall it was the battle of the race. And it was very, very amazing to watch. It had me and David land at the edge of our seats.
Yeah, obviously they pretty much put on the star of the show after a race that really wasn't that interesting in the grand scheme of things. But like you mentioned, Makoviecki really did push Bourdais out of line, especially out of Arnage that one time. And he kind of fought back, saying that Bourdais was doing the same types of moves on him that just weren't shown on TV. Obviously, hard racing all around. I don't think there was any real harm done because both of them got out of it clean. But it's just something you don't usually expect racing that hard from GT drivers. It's usually a lot more respectful towards each other.
My thing on that battle was the good thing. Makoviecki is lucky that Bourdais is a very good and clean driver, specifically clean. Because if it were me out there, cuts me off once in the straightaway, fine. Twice, whatever. Third time, I'm not going to lift, and you're getting turned. Because I think Makoviecki probably cut him off about
I'm gonna
5
test
times.
this theory at SIK.
You're going to get dumped.
That's
Get ready for another
irrelevant
concussion.
now. But
Anyways,
all right. Well, I just want to say I don't think I feel like inside Bourdais was probably thinking the same thing because he was very frustrated. I seen with his interview when he got out of the car a couple of minutes later. But you really don't want to put yourself in a position to get wrecked yourself, especially when you're only a couple hours from the finish. So I feel like Bourdais was probably considering that, probably uses better judgment and decided, no, I'm just going to back out of this one. It's better to lose a second than to lose my entire race right now.
Yeah, Bourdais just said he didn't have the will to do that.
Yeah, especially when you're that close to the finish.
Another thing I want to bring up is that the BMWs had a very good first showing at Le Mans since 2011. In the first half of the race, they were very solid. The 81 car had some sort of radiator issue in the night. Or no, it was the 82. The 81 ran pretty cleanly, but then the 82 car crashed out in the morning, and the 81 had a few niggly issues in the later going of the race. But overall, though, for their first showing at Le Mans, they had a very, very impressive run.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, with the exception of Aston Martin, on the post-qualifying VOP changes that the ACO made, I was really skeptical. I said, there's no way they're going to pull this off. These cars are way too spread out. But really, they seemed to get it all pretty much nailed down. BMW, who had no pace in qualifying, found themselves running in second place for a while. And really, it looked like they could even be a contender to win if they kept it clean. Unfortunately, they had some of those teething issues. It's pretty much expected for the first year back.
I will say, I want to compliment the MTech guys because it's not like the previous BMW attempt where they had Schnitzer, a very well-established team. MTech is a very young team. And they actually did their job very well and very efficiently and in a very time-efficient manner when it came to those niggly issues when they came up. So I'm very impressed with MTech. They had a very good race, and unfortunately the 82 car had chassis damage. And we talked about how MTech actually did a good job. Well, some of their counterparts, the core Autosport Porsche guys, actually had some not so clean of a race. Of course, the 9112 in the U.S. or the 94 that is the number that adorned the car at Le Mans, they actually had a suspension mount on the chassis fail, and they actually went through 2 chassis throughout their run up to Le Mans. So that was done with that car. They just pulled it because, chassis damage, you can't replace the chassis during a race. And the 93 car had alternator issues in the race. So that drove them out of contention, which is unfortunate. But the guys who the Manti crew, pulled away at 1-2.
Yeah, and that was great for the team, and Ford were pretty happy with their results as well. Unfortunately for them, the 67 car ended up with that penalty, like you mentioned, but the 68 car still pulling off a third-place finish. Great result for the Corvette. Partially great result for the Corvette guys. Got the 63 car up in the fourth.
Ran a flawless race. The 64 car, they were pulled in the garage very early, and then they had the floor of the car fall off on track.
The 64 car has had awful luck at Le Mans ever since 2015 when they won. Yeah, because they had that crash in 2016. They had the crash last year, and then they beached it. And then this year they had more problems with the suspension. So really they can't seem to get a grip on this race, but maybe next year is going to be their time to shine again. And the last thing to go over, of course, is prototype. The class I can probably talk for days about. Let's see, going in, I expected that we could actually see a decently close prototype race, but that wasn't the case. With qualifying, the cars were pretty much separated by about 3 seconds from the Toyota and the closest privateer. And race day, I thought that gap would go down, but it really didn't. Toyota really seemed like they could still manage everything a lot better than the privateers. And I'm not really going to criticize the result of the race because no fault of Toyota. They put in a flawless race pretty much all around. They had some issues with ignoring the slow zones and getting some penalties. But other than that, they had no issues with the cars. They were pretty much clean all throughout. And all the privateers seem to have run into some issues throughout the race. So I think Toyota's victory is well warranted. I feel like even if they were on equal ground, the Toyotas would still probably pull a 1-2 because of the issues that the privateers had. But Kevin, any thoughts on that? And then we'll jump to Kyle for his concluding thoughts.
I want to make a point about Fernando Alonso. I'm not one of the biggest fans of Fernando because of the hype around him. I dislike that. But I will say Fernando,
because there's always those people that don't like when people like someone. They gotta be the different. You know?
Well, it's just that everyone, I hate the idea that Fernando would have had things handed to him. And I will say this: he had Spa handed to him, but he actually had to earn Le Mans this year, and he pulled his weight, and he did it in a very good fashion. He made some fantastic moves around not only his teammate but traffic.
That's Fernando being Fernando.
7 car. There was no team orders. Fernando did his part, and he did it damn well, and I will commend him for that. He earned the victory, which was kind of my worry. Was we knew the 8 car was going to win, but was it going to be legit, or was it going to be, you have an active Formula One driver known as Fernando Alonso in your car? You can take the checkers, you can win. But no, he actually had to earn it, and all the props to him.
I don't even have a problem with the post-race media following him. Obviously, it's still a little bit overhyped. I don't feel like they're giving his co-drivers enough credit. But that was pretty much to be expected. But one comment I want to make about Alonso is that somebody actually averaged out the fastest 40 lap times for each driver throughout the entire race. They took the fastest 40 laps and averaged them all together. And Alonso actually had the fastest average in that category out of any driver in the field. And it was actually by quite a large margin. I believe it was around 0.8 or somewhere around there, which in the grand scheme of things, compared to his Toyota teammates, which have a ton of experience, especially guys who have been there since 2012, it's really, really impressive to see what he was able to do in season 1, and of course he'll likely be back here next year as well.
Well, on this podcast we've kind of mentioned all the David Land conspiracies. So now that he's got 2 of the Triple Crown done, it's confirmed that he's doing Indy next year. If we're going to keep to the David Land conspiracies, I also want to point that out.
Also, I want to make one final point, and this kind of could fall into in case you missed it because nobody really knew about this, but there was a fight between Porsche and Toyota mechanics after the race.
Oh,
was there?
I don't know. There was no idea about what it was about, but there was a fist fight, and they actually had to get security and police to break it up.
Was it a good fight, or was it like a NASCAR fight where they just stood there and shoved each other?
Threw helmets at each other?
There's not really that many details about it, but there was a fight.
That confuses me because Porsche wasn't even competing against Toyota, so it must have been some on-track incident or some pit road incident.
It could have been on-track, or it could have been like they were walking through the pits, and then someone walked through someone's pit stall very rudely or something, and then.
One more thing is since it's a tradition that the French military delivers the tricolor, the French flag, to start the race. Well, somebody actually dropped their phone out of the helicopter, and it landed on the grid when they were doing the flyover of the grid.
That's actually amazing.
Someone actually dropped their phone.
How bad was the phone?
It was probably dead, but whatever. There's actually photos that show the phone falling when it landed.
I want to see the phone though.
Interesting.
What kind of phone was it? Was it an iPhone? If it's an iPhone,
I don't know.
Completely dead.
It's
all ripperinos of that.
This sounds entirely to me like a bunch of rambling going on, which usually is a good time for me to cut off the episode. If you don't mind me doing that.
Well, it's a good thing. It's a basic part of in case you missed it.
Yeah, the rambling. Well, also you have to throw in the tradition of me and Kyle actually going on and on about something.
My major complaint coming out of Le Mans was the fact that they had mandated stint lengths for GTE and for LMP1. That kind of ruined the strategy game. I think that they certainly didn't need it in GTE. They already know how long those cars can pretty much last on fuel, except for the Aston and the BMW. Those are brand new cars. So I didn't see any need for that this year. And LMP1, slightly understandable. Those are brand new cars, and they really don't have enough data coming out of it. But I hope for next season at Le Mans, or next season, I should say next year at Le Mans, they drop all of that, because a lot of teams are very critical about the mandated stint lengths. It's a sports car race. Strategy is part of the game. You really shouldn't be implementing those things.
And it also kind of gave everyone a heart attack when the number 7 car slowed because they missed their pit entrance.
Yeah. But that's just my final point about the race. Overall, it wasn't the best race ever. I think we've been treated a little bit too much for the last couple of years, particularly
especially 2016.
Years like 2015, 2016. People just got to sort of acclimated to these exciting races to realize that Le Mans this year was pretty much what you would have seen around 10 years ago. Well, maybe a little more than 10 years ago when you had Audi against the privateers. It's pretty much a style of race like that, but then again, this race, just like every other race, seems to have good years and bad years. So hopefully with the new regulations coming soon, we'll be back to another high point for the race. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of the Rain Race Podcast. Dragged on a little bit longer than I expected or hoped for, but that's fine. That's usually how it all happens. You can check out all the other episodes by clicking the card at the top right if you're watching on YouTube. Other than that, we got these two guys right here. You can go check them out. And one last thing is that Ricky Taylor interview that we promised like over a month ago should be happening, and it should be uploaded within the next couple days.
A week. Yeah.
Within, I'd say before the end of the week, but again, there's no guarantees here. Also, one very last thing. Should be back to the Monday schedule for next week's episode. So I hope to see you all then. Yeah, I know, but I'm serious this time. Catch you in the next one.